Hello everyone. Tonight we start with the incredibly perplexing world of medieval romance, when astrology, hog fat, and sometimes a duel were all part of courting counsel. Imagine attempting to impress someone when your primary flirtation tool was a lute and a prayer, if you thought modern courting was difficult. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. Eye contact is said to foster closeness in contemporary romance. Depending on how long you had it, it may lead to lawsuits, engagement contracts, or suspicion in medieval Europe. During the Middle Ages, courtship frequently began with a look, not just a glance, but a well-timed, morally balanced look. It was too short, and you didn't seem interested. If it went on for too long, you were effectively asking her father to a fight or proposing marriage. Romantic, but dangerous. According to courtly love manuals, men should seem earnest yet softly, a phrase that sounds like it belongs in a perfume advertisement from the 14th century. Somewhere between "I am not planning to invade your estate" and "I greatly admire your embroidery skills" was the perfect gaze. A popular manual advised males to steer clear of prolonged gazes that make them flush. This was awkward because the disease, wind, and wine could also produce blushing. Nevertheless, the man was supposed to turn aside, cross himself, and possibly leave the area if the woman became pink. All of this didn't excite the church. They held that too much staring exposed the soul to temptation and most likely gout. Priests taught that pious appreciation, not eye-flirting, should be the source of true affection. Couples were advised to speak briefly and maintain a low look, and it was a huge scandal if someone unintentionally made eye contact in church. They could have just as well shared a tent. Eye contact was a battleground for noble ladies. Status women were taught to keep the courtly appearance, emotionless, aloof, and slightly bored. A straying glance could be interpreted as dyspepsia, witchcraft, or flirtation, all of which are equally harmful. Nevertheless, individuals continued to look at each other across muddy market squares and banquet rooms in spite of everything. Poems about half-heartbeat long stolen glances were written by lovers. Troubadours performed ballads about soul-piercing eyes, which is poetic because they gazed at me for a little longer than was permitted by society. With the exception of raw panic, rosemary, or a nice, sharp breeze, deodorant did not exist in the Middle Ages. Despite this, individuals continued to try to smell nice. Your love success actually depended on whether or not you smelled like thyme, according to some dating advice. In the Middle Ages, herbs were the solution to both seduction and cleanliness. You did not reach for cologne to impress a prospective companion. You grabbed your soup pot, your garden, or your pharmacy if you were in a pinch. Men were often advised to stuff sprigs of lavender, sage, or rosemary into their boots or sleeves. In this manner, they would leave a trail of floral mystery each time they passed a lady. Did it cover up the smell of wool and leather and sweat? Not really, but it demonstrated effort, and half the fight was already won. Possessing a pomander, a chic tiny ball containing herbs, spices, and occasionally dried oranges, was a sign of affluence. It moved wildly as you went, dangled from a chain on your belt, and finally sent out the powerful message, "I bathe." Women also tucked herbs into their corsets or carried scented sachets for both olfactory and flea-repellent purposes. After all, romance is much simpler when lice are absent. Some manuals even suggested applying plants directly to the skin: marjoram for charm, mint for freshness, and basil for assertiveness. According to a love literature from the 13th century, the heart becomes apparent when thyme is rubbed on the chest. This is either frightening or symbolic. Someone tried it anyway. Not all odors were made equal, of course. Despite being widespread, garlic sent mixed signals. Yes, it demonstrated vigor, but it also gave out a turnip-like odor. And if the smell of pickled fish and beer was on your breath, There was no romantic failure there. It was only Tuesday. Poetry was not only for creative types in the medieval era, for the socially awkward noble who had more access to ink than charm. It was practically a love language. Here's the twist, though. Praising your beloved's appearance or personality was not the most socially acceptable method to show affection. That was too worldly, I must say. Since nothing screams, "I want to court you modestly," like, "You remind me of the Holy Mother of God," you were instead encouraged to compare her to divine figures, preferably the Virgin Mary, in part to please the Church and in part because people didn't want to be excommunicated for being lustful in rhyme. Courtly love songs were frequently quite devout. O lady, purest of light, thy gaze more sacred than sacred right, is a poem that your typical medieval suitor may write, which when you hear him compare her to a baptismal fountain, sounds adorable. A whole genre of romantic bewilderment was born out of this practice. You're reading a love letter 1 minute, and then you're not sure if it's for you or a monastery. Even in the 12th century, a particularly well-known poem that referred to the beloved as "my angel of chaste delight" is the kind of stuff that leaves you wanting more. Many aristocrats employed troubadours to compose love ballads for them, which further complicated matters. Verse that straddled the thin line between amorous and legally debatable was the specialty of these bards. The outcome? Songs that complimented your moral character, hair, and soul, without hinting at any immorality. In essence, medieval sexting consisted of 27 verses that said, "I admire your virtue from afar." Some women responded with their own poetry, which was generally a little more candid. "I respect your politeness, your bravery, and your possession of land," which is still a good criterion, to be honest. Overall, medieval poetry served as a secure means of expressing affection without actually saying it. Perhaps include a psalm quote for good measure, wrap it in Latin, and rhyme it elegantly. In this manner, you might simply say it was intended for a nun in the event that something went wrong. Suppose you have written a sincere greeting to your sweetheart that is full of religious analogies, artistic restraint, and a tasteful lack of emotional vulnerability. Excellent work. You're not done yet, though. You must now season it. Yes, the scent was just as important as the words in a proper love letter throughout the Middle Ages. The pinnacle of refinement and romantic flair was scented parchment. Additionally, the typical 14th century romantic sought for the spice rack, whereas contemporary loves could spritz perfume. If you truly wanted to impress someone with sensitive sinuses, you could add ground nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, and rose petals. These were the scents of love, or at least the greatest way to cover up the smell of medieval hands, wet parchment, and ink. Courtly tradition held that these spices had symbolic importance in addition to being ornamental. Passion was symbolized by cinnamon. Devotion was symbolized by cloves. Since saffron was pricey, it conveyed the message, "I have money, please notice me." Naturally, after 3 days of journeying through rain and goat traffic in a sweaty satchel, the letter primarily smelled like parchment stew by the time it reached its recipient. Some especially aspirational lovers included crushed rosemary, dried violets, marjoram, and flower petals folded into the message. Fennel was mentioned by one unfortunate suitor, which was immediately taken as a slight unless the woman was a salad. Richer courts would infuse entire scrolls with musk or rosewater, not for subtlety, but to make sure the aroma hit the receiver square in the nose. The aim was not subtlety. Excessive floral attack? Much better. The wax seals were also in vogue. These could be pressed with elaborate family crests and flavored, scented with oils. Like a seal that smelled of frankincense and parental expectations, my loves are genuine and unspoken. Some, of course, went too far. There are stories of letters that were so strongly flavored that they were misinterpreted as cursed scrolls or prescriptions for medicines. A well-known poem with a strong scent is said to have drawn mice during delivery. Romance was difficult. Chocolates, flowers, and the occasional playlist are all possible components of modern dating. In Europe in the Middle Ages, a freshly dead wild creature was frequently used as a token of affection. Knights and noblemen sometimes gave their beloveds the hunt's spoils as a sign of their valor, manhood, and skill. A newly killed boar's head, still a little steaming, was preferable to a bouquet of roses. "I think of you when I throw spears" was the true meaning of that phrase. This was not regarded as odd. It was really encouraged. The chivalric tradition of the 14th century held that a man's hunting prowess demonstrated his suitability as a suitor. You were essentially a medieval Ryan Gosling if you could track down a stag, wrestle it to the ground, and serve its antlers on a silver platter. Women were also supposed to appear happy. When presented with a basket of doves or a skinned rabbit, a lady would react with courteous joy, or at the very least, a well-rehearsed gasp of awe. Some of these animal symbols were meaningful, even if she was secretly wondering where to keep her third hair of the week. For example, if a swan hadn't bitten anyone while being captured, it would have symbolized grace and purity. Although they needed frequent feeding, training, and occasionally biting off your fingers, falcons were a common high-status gift that were linked with aristocracy and power. Romantic, smaller prey such as hedgehogs, ferrets, or the perennially popular rabbit were occasionally used by less aristocratic males. According to reports, a miller's daughter received a duck from a lovesick baker, but it ended up escaping into her family's well. That relationship didn't work out. However, the pinnacle of medieval courtship, the presentation of the ceremonial deer. In this extravagant custom, a knight would serve a whole roasted deer to a woman at a banquet in her honor. There would frequently be music, flattery, and roughly 50 other people acting as though this wasn't really weird. Naturally, this was predicated on the woman's preference for meat. The gift of bloodied fur could backfire if she didn't or if she had a weak stomach. Terribly. Nevertheless, a dead animal wrapped in ribbon made a very clear statement in a world without casual coffee shops or dating apps. I risked illness. I braved the jungle, and all the while I had you in mind. Open flattery was fraught with danger in medieval courting. Telling a woman that she's gorgeous, too forward. Making a remark about her lips, outrageous. Talking about her hair, dangerous. It was most likely shielded by a wimple, 3 veils, and divine protection. What then might be safely praised? Her footwear. Yes, pointing out that someone had well-formed shoes was essentially the medieval equivalent of firing your shot in a society where flirting might result in excommunication. Silently, from the other side of the room, and with a glance at the floor. Shoes were a fashion statement in addition to being functional. Poulaines, or pointed shoes, were very fashionable. Some were so long that in order to prevent tripping, they had to be tied to the wearer's knees. It was truly amazing if a woman could walk in them with grace and not fall into a moat. And well qualified, a man could come across as respectful, perceptive, and not immediately interested in sin by complimenting her shoes. According to a 13th century etiquette book, you should make a remark about a woman's attire or gait when you first meet her, but avoid looking above her ankle to avoid embarrassing her. Interpretation: be cautious, make her hemline flatter. And it was the other way around. If a man's boots were made of high-end leather imported from Florence or didn't smell like dead badger, women may bring them up. The last one was uncommon. This compliment was obviously a coded gesture. A common way to compliment a woman's shoes is to say, "I've noticed you. You seem elegant to me. Before my father arranges for me to marry a stranger, please decipher this subliminal message." Furthermore, it was essentially a proposal if she gave a grin, a nod, or, God forbid, a compliment in return. Your cloak is well stitched and your shoes are exquisitely constructed, according to one documented exchange. Married 2 months later, the agreement was sealed with a vineyard and 5 goats. Yes, saying your shoes look extremely competent was perhaps the safest, sweetest, and strangest way to express that you liked someone in the complex social rituals of medieval love. Nowadays, we say that timing is crucial. Timing was crucial during the Middle Ages, the divine order, astrology, and perhaps the reason you didn't get married. Yes, those did exist according to a number of medieval love manuals. It was best to express your feelings when the moon was in the right phase and Mercury wasn't pouting, not when the time felt perfect. When the moon was waxing, it was considered a time of expansion, good fortune, and audacious statements. Therefore, it would be preferable to whisper your eternal love to the blacksmith's daughter at that time, preferably with a rose or a bird that is moderately damaged in your hand and drenched in silver moonlight. A diminishing moon, on the other hand, was bad for romance. It was thought that everything that was initiated during a waning moon would eventually fade, including friendships, relationships, and poorly timed soup. Astrologers would stoically nod and respond, yes, obviously, if you confessed during a waning moon and were turned down. Others dug even further. Avoid eclipses unless you want your proposal to be followed by crop failure or public humiliation, and avoid the full moon if you're very emotional. According to a monk from the 14th century, who had likely not dated for decades, expressing love beneath a new moon would bring bad luck, teeth decay, and spiritual disorientation. So, of course, someone gave it a try. Later, a goose bitten him. Is it a coincidence? Medieval brains refused. Peasants were not the only ones who held this view. Before sending love letters, setting up betrothals, or even just flirting across a dinner table, nobles sought advice from court astrologers. The 1300s equivalent of ghosting via star chart includes documented instances of nobles postponing marriages in order to align their planets more favorably. Some, of course, thought the moon was a justification. Beatrix, I do like you, but my heart has to submit to the laws of the universe because Saturn is in retrograde right now. But perhaps it wasn't so odd to examine the sky before saying I love you in a world of wild boar attacks, political alliances, and questionable cleanliness. In the Middle Ages, love wasn't always up to chance. It was occasionally left to the mixtures of witches, herbalists, or your grandmother's slightly strange neighbor who kept dried frogs in her cupboard. Then came the love potion, the medieval solution to romantic rejection, awkward flirtation, and the age-old query, what if I could just make them like me with soup? Seldom were these brews subtle. Since nothing says romance like organ dust, one well-liked recipe called for honey, basil, and powdered deer heart. Other variants included wine, cinnamon, rose petals, and even something scary like charred hair ashes. To mix that into a drink, you have to be deeply in love. Before your crush bites into anything that tastes like rosemary and regret, it's okay if some potions were buried beneath thresholds, dabbed onto garments, or concealed inside baked delicacies. It becomes more bizarre. There are recipes that call for boiling fingernails, graveyard dirt, and even black cat fat. Please, no real cats. People in the Middle Ages had some crazy ideas. To be clear, the way to be cursed today is to say a chant over a piece of bread before sunrise, and then serve it to your beloved without telling them, according to a charm from the 12th century. These love potions were more than just folk magic, which is odd. They were treated with seriousness. Potion manufacturers were occasionally tried by courts for enchantment of nobles. Because the woman wore enchanted rosemary, one nobleman said he was enticed against his will. Yes, Harold, the herbs are to blame. Naturally, not all of the potions were effective. Many simply made folks feel ill, lightheaded, or inexplicably inclined to compose poetry. But belief was strong. People occasionally pretended to be in love if they believed they were, which isn't all that different from dating in the modern world after drinking a few glasses of wine. Love in the Middle Ages was more than just a sentimental affair. Honor, hurt egos, and the occasional dented helmet were all involved. One of two reactions was required by medieval etiquette. If a guy even looked at your beloved for a fraction of a second longer than was necessary, compose a poem that uses passive aggression. Put him up for a duel. Most opted for option 2, which had more blood and quicker results. The noble rule of knightly behavior, known as chivalry, placed a strong focus on protecting a lady's honor. Even if the woman in question didn't request it, even if she didn't know anything had happened, and even if she had actually looked at the other man first, it wouldn't matter. A glove would be thrown down, your sword would be drawn, and you would say something like, "Sir, you have insulted my lady's virtue with thine eyes. Get your spleen ready." From intense horse and lance jousts to rather less spectacular encounters with swords and axes or intense gazing contests, duels might take many different forms. Killing wasn't always the goal. It was to demonstrate your willingness to attempt. There's nothing like taking a chance on tetanus to show how much you mean to me. These competitions occasionally included official regulations, referees, and spectators. I have no regrets about the other occasions when they were spontaneous and concluded with at least one person shouting in the village fountain. This was flattering and exhausting for the women. It was nearly impossible to navigate a marketplace without causing a small altercation over your ankle ribbon. Some women claimed to have bad vision in an attempt to diffuse the situation. "Oh no, I didn't see that squire's jawline. I was staring at the cabbage wagon." To be fair, love wasn't the reason for every dull. Some were due to mispronouncing another man's name, some were political, and some were overland. However, the stakes seemed to be larger when romance was involved, particularly when the reward was a noblewoman who was only vaguely impressed and a remote possibility of getting her hand in marriage. The medieval answer, then, was straightforward. If your crush was staring at other men, challenge, clash, win affection, and bleed a little. War and love were more than simply metaphors throughout the Middle Ages. They matched one another. Furthermore, you didn't purchase a pastry or compose a poem to demonstrate your love for your girlfriend. You fastened her favorite ribbon on your chest and strapped on 40 pounds of armor. It was a fairly widespread habit known as wearing her colors. Before leaving for battle or a joust competition, knights would secure a lady's token, a handkerchief, a veil, or a piece of lace in a visible location. The symbolism was straightforward. I defend her honor. I also look fantastic in purple. It was strategic as well as romantic. Wearing a noblewoman's colors may help a knight gain favor, gain respect, and possibly increase his chances of getting baked sweets when he returned. There was a catch, though. Even if your gift, for instance, was embroidered with flowers and smelled like her laundry, you still had to look respectable. A few nights became really dramatic. Men have been known to wear their ladies' gown sleeves completely on their armor, dangling clumsily and sometimes catching on weapons. It was stunning when a garter was placed over the helmet of one unfortunate person, but it slipped down in the middle of the joust, causing a little concussion. The choice of color was also important. Passion was symbolized by the color red. Blue was a symbol of devotion. Green was a complex color. Depending on the area, green may indicate fertility, hope, or the possibility that your romantic partner was seeing other knights. Dangerous enterprise. The tradition's detractors, of course, said that it made warriors appear more like walking laundry racks than soldiers, but they frequently failed to get dates. Is it a coincidence? Probably not. Some women went one step further and embroidered blessings or inscriptions into the fabric. gentle words of support such as "Congratulations to my champion," or "Try to avoid bleeding out once more," sensible and sincere. The knights saw it as a sign of pride and a highly visible method to show that they cared about someone and that they weren't scared of being mildly impaled for it. To outsiders, it could have seemed ridiculous to see tough warriors entering battle with lace ribbons fluttering beside their swords. If you were interested in someone in the Middle Ages, you didn't text them or look at their parchment scrolls. In the hopes that they were awake and that their father wasn't a light sleeper, you stood outside their window at night and sang loudly. Second only to avoiding death in combat, serenading was seen as one of the most romantic and noble things a suitor could do. A well-sung ballad has the power to win people over, melt hearts, and even make you smile awkwardly the next time she walks by you at church. Here, well executed is crucial. Professional musicians made up the majority of medieval suitors. Yes, they had lutes, those ungainly, pear-shaped devices that usually seemed to have been tuned by accident, but they had no notion how to play them. Furthermore, there wasn't technically a pop chorus in medieval music. It relied more on chanting. What did these unfortunate people chant then? Sometimes written in Latin to sound important, sometimes in French to sound expensive, and sometimes in a regional dialect that sounded like they were choking on bread. These love songs are about lilies, stars, and unending passion. A kid of a baker in Rouen is known to have tried to play a moonlit serenade on a borrowed mandolin. In the second verse, his voice failed, and in the third, his instrument shattered. Even if the performance sounded like a dying goat in distress, ladies were supposed to listen silently, perhaps glance through the shutters, and most definitely not laugh out. They drop a flower, a ribbon, a sign of encouragement, or in certain situations, a courteous cough as a matter of courtesy. Indeed, it did work occasionally. At midnight, a passable tune may win people over. In other cases, it won you a bucket of water from a chamber pot that was poured from above, a classic way to get amorous feedback. Even though your only audience was a startled owl and a very dissatisfied cat, singing your feelings into the night had a heroic quality in the medieval mentality. Medieval singles looked to nature in a time when there were no dating apps, moisturizers, or even simple dental plans. Naturally, we're referring to their spice rack. Yes, this was one strange but well-liked dating tip. Apply herbs to your face. The reasoning? Get married, look radiant, and smell nice. Surprisingly, medieval herbalists and love guides were certain of this. It was claimed that basil inspired love. A headstrong maiden's heart would be softened by marjoram. Rosemary is beneficial for flirting and memory. Someone would want to marry you, or at the very least follow you around with courtesy, if you smelt like a herb garden. It was suggested that men smear a paste made from crushed herbs along their jawlines. Like some sort of toner from the 14th century, women frequently blended theirs with water and applied it to their cheeks and temples. The outcomes? Mixed, very ambiguous. Picture yourself arriving at a feast with thyme leaves lodged in your eyebrow and parsley oil streaming down your neck. Theoretically charming, in actuality, alarming. Certain guides become detailed. At morning, a man should wash his face with mint so that everyone will find him attractive. This sounds noble until you realize that they most likely meant really taking a bath in mint. That is, if you had access to both mint and water, which is a luxury. Rosewater, saffron, and sandalwood were employed in herbal mixtures by the wealthy, more to smell like someone who didn't work as a pig wrestler than for seduction. The impoverished survived on onions, garlic, or anything else that didn't draw rodents. Romantic. Although applying basil on your cheeks did not ensure success, it did demonstrate effort, and in a culture where bathing was only done once every 6 months, smelling anything but disappointed was already a positive beginning. It's interesting to note that this approach gave rise to whole industries. Apothecaries promised to make their customers appealing by selling love salves made from crimson mashed-up garden trimmings and proprietary formulations. The outcomes might have differed. Goat interest and sneezing were among the side effects. Medieval romantics resorted to flowers, which are safer and far more mysterious, in a time where declaring your love for someone explicitly could result in controversy, a duel, or a very tense supper with your father's overlord. A single flower could convey more emotional weight than a whole scroll of poetry, and there would be fewer spelling mistakes. Welcome to the botanical secret code of medieval courtship. The reasoning was straightforward. Every bloom had a purpose. Violet stood for modesty, lilies for purity, red roses for love, and lavender for, "I'd like to woo you, but let's not get excommunicated over it." Social anxiety, a coded message wrapped in petals, and puzzle-like bouquets were all used. Do you want to show your passion while yet being believable? Send a concoction of fascination, carnation, stupidity, and columbine. Want to say you're sorry for inadvertently making out with her sister? I apologize for the mess. Throw in some white hyacinth. Do you want to end things amicably? The yellow carnation, which is fancy yet rejected, is a flower for that as well. This was more than a little courtly play. Gardens became emotional minefields as entire medieval books explained the meanings of flowers and plants. Carry a daisy in your belt while you stroll around the courtyard? Are you declaring innocence? Put a thistle on a person's door? In essence, I would prefer to wed a goat. Naturally, women gave a similar response. Interest was shown by a returned bloom. Throwing a flower into a ditch symbolized no. A notorious noblewoman is said to have responded to a bouquet by saying, "I prefer monks," along with a dead weed. It hurt. And suppose your bad luck was real. The family goat might consume your flowery gesture before it reaches its intended recipient. In the Middle Ages, romance was nothing if not unpredictable. This flowery drama was also adopted in public gatherings. Knights occasionally wore bouquets from women during tournaments as a sign of loyalty as well as for aesthetic reasons, or at least an effort to appear brave while brandishing a mace. In the Middle Ages, dancing was more than just a recreational activity. Played with your feet, your dignity, and a strong sense of where your hands should not be placed, it was a delicate game of romantic chess. Dancing was one of the few socially acceptable methods to interact with someone of the other sex in courtly circles, as long as you didn't squirm too much, perspire too much, or, God forbid, touch them more than your fingertips. The majority of dances weren't quite what we now consider to be dancing. Ignore dips and spinning. The court dances of the Middle Ages resembled slow-motion marching drills with extra curtsies, gliding slowly in synchronized lines, looking courteously, and silently yelling within because you just touched elbows were all part of the bass dance, which is essentially a low dance. It was exciting, though. During a paired step, touching fingertips was essentially a marriage proposal. Your aunt was stitching your wedding gown after one more spin. There were many coded messages in dancing. "I admire you" might be said with a lengthy look during a turn. A missed step could be interpreted as "I am not worthy of your affection." Furthermore, it was likely that you would never speak again after stepping on her foot. Village dances had somewhat more lenient standards for the more gregarious. Although the carol, a circle dance with singing, was more laid back, it was nonetheless rigorously observed by chaperones who had no chill whatsoever and hawk-like intuition. Live minstrels, bagpipes, or someone striking a drum that might or might not have been a repurposed cooking pot were the sources of the music. In order to avoid public embarrassment, minor injuries, or stomping on a noblewoman's gown, a crime punishable in at least 3 provinces, dancers had to move in unison. It's interesting to note that some love guidelines even recommended figuring out your partner's characteristics by looking at how they dance. wild and unpredictable, passionate, a good match, graceful and well-coordinated, flailing like a wounded goose. You've written the poems, sang under her window, donned her colours, and avoided getting gored in a joust, but maybe you're not ready for commitment. You're almost there. Congratulations. Her family is the last boss struggle in a medieval romance. In the Middle Ages, gaining a woman's affection was only half the battle. Convincing her parents, particularly her father, that you were sufficiently affluent, somewhat sane, and not currently excommunicated was the other half. It was rarely a romantic procedure. There were land talks, dowries, and a string of heated meals where everyone acted as though they weren't forming a little feudal alliance. Families were looking for evidence of stability. Have you any sheep? Have you got any land? Is at least one of your teeth functional? These were, are you emotionally available's medieval counterparts. Frequently the response remained negative. The woman's family occasionally insisted on symbolic presents as a sign of investment as well as devotion. A good suitor would present a carved spoon, a coat, or a bag of grain. A rich person may send gold, horses, even a whole pig. You brought many pigs and maybe a monk to explain your plans if you truly wanted to impress. Things could be more casual in towns and villages, but not significantly. Your ability to wrestle a neighbor across property borders, your boots, or your handshake may be used by a father to determine your value. It was not a nuance-based system. Mothers weren't any simpler. Some insisted on using puzzles, church attendance, or the capacity to eat for extended periods of time without blinking as ways to evaluate your character. A mother who only permitted suitors who could churn butter is described in one document, effective and discerning. And there were still alliances to think about, even if the family liked you. Marriages were more than just romantic partnerships. They were asset mergers. You asked for more than simply her hand in marriage. Her family was aware that you were requesting some degree of authority over their goat farm. Nevertheless, they may nod in agreement if you passed their tests and demonstrated that you were courageous, courteous, and reasonably solvent. Only once, perhaps. That nod too, your green light was that. Death was not the end of the path for a Viking. It was just the beginning of something much bigger. Earthly life, complete with feast halls, arduous journeys and battle cries, was really a testing field. What really mattered was what lied beyond. Depending on how you lived, the Norse had several options for where to go after death, and above all, how you passed away. You had an opportunity to be selected by the Valkyries if you died a warrior's death with courage in your heart and a blade in your hand. These legendary women, who were Odin's ferocious attendants, searched battlegrounds and chose the most courageous of the dead. Their prize, a location in Asgard's Valhalla, Odin's personal mead hall. The deceased warriors would train there for the last terrible conflict, Ragnarok. They engaged in spectacular fight with each other during the day. At night, they feasted and drank as though it were their final day. Then they repeated the process. However, not every soul ended up in Valhalla. Half of the battle dead were also claimed by Freya, the goddess of war and love, who wanted to live in her hall, Folkvanga. Others may travel to Helheim, a dark world governed by the goddess Hel, particularly if they were judged unworthy of warrior glory or died of illness or old age. Helheim wasn't precisely a party, but it wasn't necessarily a place of suffering like the Christian hell. The hierarchy of the afterlife was very important, as was the manner of burial. A warrior who wanted to get to Valhalla couldn't be thrown into a ditch with regrets and a few bones. According to Viking belief, a proper funeral could facilitate a soul's journey to the proper realm. They gave funerals a great deal of attention, making sure the departed were respected, remembered, and, most importantly, outfitted. The deceased were revered, and frequently even feared, whether they were buried in a mound surrounded by food, weapons and treasures, or cremated aboard a burning ship. Nobody wanted to face with the possibility of a restless soul resurfacing if the funeral ceremonies weren't performed correctly. Because death was not definitive in the Viking world, but rather the result of wrong handling. The living might be haunted by that. Viking funerals conjure images of a long, burning ship cruising into the sunset. And that flaming image isn't just a fantasy, even though Hollywood exaggerates a lot. It has its roots in authentic Norse customs. A ship was more than just a means of capturing territory or raiding monasteries to the Vikings. It was a hallowed means of realm travel. A ship represented transit in both life and death. As a result, when a high-ranking individual, a chieftain, warrior, or noblewoman died, they were occasionally buried on, in, or with their ship. The symbolism stayed the same, but the specific ceremony changed according to time, place, and available resources. With style bid the soul go. In coastal areas, particularly those near Norway and Sweden, it was customary to dig a sizable trench in the style of a ship, install a real ship inside, and then surround the body with grave goods, weapons, shields, food, animals, and even captives or thralls that had been sacrificed. Indeed, in many instances, it was thought that the deceased's closest relatives, particularly slaves, accompanied them into the afterlife, whether voluntarily or not. Following the preparation of the deceased, the ship was frequently covered with dirt and stones, creating what is now known as a burial mound. Beneath these mounds, several of the most well-known Viking graves, including the Gokstad and Oseberg ships, were discovered in excellent preservation. These locations served as memorials as well as graves. What about the fire, though? It was probably reserved for certain island or coastal populations to see the dramatic boat on fire floating into the ocean. In some instances, the corpse and burial items were loaded onto a smaller vessel, pushed into the water, and burned with pitch, tar, or oil. The fire had both utilitarian and symbolic meanings. In addition to warding off bad spirits and purifying the soul, it also destroyed the vessel, forbidding its reuse, a one-way pass to the next world. But not many Vikings could afford such a grandiose farewell. The cost of ships was high. The only people who could be honored in this way were the affluent traders, jarls, monarchs, and the elite. The majority of common people were interred in less elaborate ways, frequently in shallow graves with small presents. The ship, however, continued to be the most recognizable representation of Norse funeral customs. It was the means by which a Viking was transported from Midgard to forever, whether buried under the dirt or engulfed by fire. Because the sea called even in death. Cremation was probably the most common Viking funeral custom, particularly in the early Viking age, even though ship burials may have taken center stage in the movies. And have faith in the Norse to transform a mundane fire into a spectacular, cosmic occurrence. Burning the body was more than just a method of disposal for the Vikings, it was a metamorphosis of the sacred. Fire was seen as a messenger and a cleanser. They thought the smoke conveyed the spirit to Freya, Odin, or wherever their soul was meant to go while flames ate flesh and bone. Usually cremation was performed on top of a big wooden pyre that was thoughtfully constructed. The deceased's body would be placed in the center, adorned in their best attire, and encircled by their most valuable belongings: tools, food, jewelry for noblewomen, weapons for soldiers, or even a beloved pet. These were not merely sentimental burial items, they were thought to assist the departed in their next life. In certain instances, the burning might be preceded by a ceremonial or funeral feast. Friends and family would get together to grieve, sing, and tell stories about the departed, frequently for several days. The Viking poets known as skalds may perform poetry in their honor. Additionally, ritual animal sacrifices were not unheard of. In order to have friends in the afterlife, horses and dogs, animals with significant symbolic value, were occasionally murdered and placed on the pyre. Indeed, the fire was enormous, it must have been. It takes a tremendous quantity of fire and wood to burn a corpse to ash. Both gods and humans would be drawn to the pyre as it raged, its smoke rising into the sky. The visible entrance between the living and the dead was a potent and revered sight to many. The remains, ashes, pieces of bone, and burnt weaponry were carefully collected once the fire was extinguished. They could be distributed throughout a holy location or put in an urn and buried. In order to preserve the location for future generations, the ashes were occasionally even interred in unique mounds or behind rune stones. Cremation wasn't sterile or filthy to the Norse. It was a declaration to the world, a booming, triumphant departure. This soul is now riding the smoke to the heavens because it mattered. Why would you enter the hereafter without a sword, just as you wouldn't go on a Viking raid without one? Grave goods, or items buried or burnt with the deceased to help them in the afterlife, were extremely important in Viking funeral customs. These weren't merely symbols of affection. They served as symbols, tools, and sustenance to prepare the deceased for whatever hardships awaited them after death. For fighters, this meant a strong shield, their finest sword or axe, and occasionally even an entire suit of armor. However, these weren't always useful weapons of battle. In order for the weapon to accompany the spirit, some swords were purposefully twisted or shattered before being buried. It also had the ingenious secondary function of deterring tomb robbers. Richer Vikings were interred with coins, drinking horns, gold and silver, and even imported luxury goods like silk or jewelry made by the Franks. Looms, elaborate brooches, keys, and other objects associated with domestic life may be buried alongside women. Toys or tiny animals were frequently buried with children. However, we must not overlook the major accessories. They could include dogs, horses, falcons, or even whole boats. Additionally, human sacrifices were not unheard of in tombs of especially high importance. It was thought that slaves or servants, who were frequently drugged or ceremonially murdered, would go with their owners into the afterlife to continue serving them. It serves as a somber reminder that in Viking culture, prestige followed a person into old age. However, not every grave good was only useful. A few were symbolic. A broken comb could stand for a hammer for Thor's protection, a fishing hook for survival, or hygiene. Deliberate, spiritual, and frequently highly personal decisions were made. It's interesting that these traditions differed by area. For instance, ornate boat tombs with expensive artifacts were more typical in Sweden, while because of limited means, burial was frequently simpler in Iceland. As conversions spread, some Norse villages incorporated local customs, such as combining early Christian emblems with pagan grave gifts. Grave items were not limited to the deceased. They described a person's identity, values, manner of passing away, and legacy to the living. A well-packed burial wasn't a morbid custom to a Viking. It was a declaration of value, a last rite of respect, and possibly a ticket to Valhalla. A Viking funeral was not a hasty farewell. It was an occasion, a lavish, frequently multi-day gathering that was full of ritual, symbolism, and the kind of dramatic flair that was unique to Norse culture. After all, your send-off had to be fitting if your death was meant to be the beginning of an epic journey. Preparation preceded the festivities. In order to maintain their appearance, the deceased's body would be cleaned and dressed in their best attire, occasionally with cosmetics or a mask added. The community's women, who were regarded as spiritual guardians of both life and death, were usually in charge of this duty. These ladies may have been vulvas or professional mourners or priestesses with ceremonial power. Then the party began. To honor the deceased, warriors, friends, family, and occasionally entire towns would gather. Those who attend more affluent funerals may travel great distances, These were intensely communal times with equal parts celebration and grief. Imagine it as a somber wake with a dash of drinking competition. The sacrificer, a priest or chieftain who performed the ceremonies, was one of the most influential participants in the ceremony. Offerings of blood, sometimes animal, sometimes human, may fall under this category. Dogs and horses were frequently offered as sacrifices to go with the dead into the afterlife. As a last display of devotion or dominance, slaves were occasionally given drugs, strangled or stabbed, and then laid next to their lord. Poetry and music were vital. Skalds would recite the actions of the deceased, narrating their travels, charity, and valiant battles. By elevating the dead and establishing their legacy among the living, and possibly even the gods, these lyrics did more than merely provide entertainment. The burial itself was the culmination. Whether it was mound burial, ship burial, or cremation, this was where the event reached its most poignant point. Mourners may shout goodbye, make last toasts, or scatter cash, amulets, or mementos of love into the grave as the flames ascended or the soil fell. The funeral feast follows the burial. Merriment, meat, and mead were not merely decadent, they were spiritual. Eating together paid respect to the deceased and strengthened ties between the living. Life went on, but memories persisted. Beyond simply burying the deceased, these customs assisted in grieving, establishing the legitimacy of heirs, and upholding social order. The focus of a Viking funeral focused more on legacy than death. This is one of the details about Viking funerals that tends to make people laugh and occasionally feel queasy. Although it wasn't practiced at every burial, human sacrifice was real and had a profound spiritual and historical impact when it did occur. According to Norse mythology, your life in Midgard continued into the afterlife. Therefore, it made sense to the Vikings that a great warlord or chieftain would want servants, guards, or concubines in the hereafter if he had them in the real world. But those friends had to learn that lesson the hard way, of course. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab ambassador who observed a Viking funeral on the Volga River in the 10th century, provides the most thorough description of such a ceremony. He gave a graphic account of the ritual murder of a female slave who volunteered, or was selected, to go to the afterlife with her owner. He referred to this woman as the Angel of Death. The procedure was neither lenient nor rapid. She was stabbed and strangled before being placed next to the dead in a burning ship following days of planning, drinking, ritual sex, and ceremonial parading. Unsettling, of course. However, it was a religious obligation, possibly even an honor to the Vikings. At least some people believed that serving your master in the afterlife by dying was a sign of devotion and spiritual advancement. To be clear, however, it was also a ruthlessly patriarchal technique based on control and power relations. Not every sacrifice was made by humans. It was far more customary to kill animals to go with the dead, particularly horses, dogs, and occasionally oxen. These animals represented power, prestige, and camaraderie. They fulfilled social and spiritual functions by being buried there. The practice of human sacrifice declined over time, particularly as Christianity expanded throughout the Norse world. These rites appalled Christian clerics, and local kings who were keen to join European powers started to ban them. The majority of Viking lands had stopped the practice by the 11th century. Nevertheless, these sacrifices continue to be among the most eerie features of Viking funerals, serving as a reminder that despite its poetry and bravery, Norse culture also accepted some very sinister customs in the name of honor and legacy. The Viking aristocracy took people, whether they wanted to or not, along with their wealth when they died. The burial mound was the ultimate mic drop if Viking funerals were intended to amaze both gods and mortals. Like silent, imposing reminders that someone significant had passed away and insisted on being remembered, these tall clay tombs were scattered throughout the Norse landscape. The Norse transformed the pre-Viking custom of constructing burial mounds, or hauga, into an art form. These were architectural statements rather than simple tombs, territorial markers combined with spiritual lighthouses. A mound's size and intricacy frequently represented the deceased's wealth and power. You were important if your mound was visible from the enemy settlement across the river, from the fjord, or from a passing road. The first step in the procedure was choosing the location. The location was crucial. A chieftain with naval might be indicated by a burial mound close to the ocean. One erected on top of a hill may control a valley, claiming the territory after death. In many instances, subsequent generations even used previous burial mounds, creating a feeling of spiritual lineage and ancestral continuity. The body was typically interred inside the mound with all the grave items appropriate for the afterlife in a timber chamber, stone-lined trench, or ship. The room may have wooden furnishings, armor, or layers of textiles. The mound was built by piling stones, sand, and soil in a precisely formed dome after it was sealed. Some were small, while others were enormous, with a circumference of more than 100 feet. Standing stones were placed in ship-like shapes around many mounds. Others had carved staves or wooden poles on top, perhaps to direct the spirit upward or to fend off tomb robbers. However, mounds were political as well as burial. A chieftain's mound was more than just a grave. It was a declaration of power, even in death. At these locations, local communities would still congregate for seasonal celebrations, oaths, and rituals. It appeared like the dead never truly went away. They formed a part of the spiritual landscape of the nation. In Scandinavia, burial mounds are still revered locations today. Some have not been disturbed, while others have been dug up to uncover priceless artifacts and eerie remnants of Norse culture. Built by a people who understood that the only true way to immortality was to be remembered. These grassy hills are more than simply soil and bones. They are monuments to legacy. Although the blood-stained axes of men are used to tell a lot of Viking history, their funerals provide a more nuanced picture, particularly in regards to the position of women. Viking women weren't merely obedient mourners at the tomb. They were the focal point of many funerals and were adored, feared, and grieved. The burial of two high-status women in the Oseberg ship, rather than a male warrior, is one of the most amazing finds in Viking archaeology. The women were buried in royal splendor, surrounded by silks, carvings, food, and a full wagon on a sumptuous wooden ship. Although their identities are still unknown, researchers surmise that one of them might have been a spiritual leader, Norse priestess, vulva, or seer. The vulva had great ceremonial power in Norse culture. She guided the living through life and death, discerned the threads of fate, and conversed with the gods. The vulva and other women were frequently in charge of preparing the deceased. They would execute rites of cleansing, incantations, and washing and dressing the corpse. Even Viking warriors revered the unique but powerful spiritual authority they possessed as a result of their participation in burial rites. Then there were the shield maidens, fabled women who fought with men and occasionally had the same blazing send-offs. Some tombs, such as the Birka warrior burial in Sweden, feature female remains buried with full military honors, weapons, and riding gear. However, historical evidence for shield maidens is still up for debate. In death, these women received the same treatment as their male warrior counterparts, indicating that, at least sometimes, martial bravery was genderless. However, not every funerary role was heroic. As Ibn Fadlan's tale gruesomely demonstrates, female slaves or concubines were occasionally slaughtered at the funerals of influential men. As a somber reminder of the harsh social structures in Norse civilization, these women were either offered or coerced into dying in order to serve their masters in the afterlife. However, Viking burial customs suggested a culture that might be unexpectedly flexible and patriarchal. Women may be victims, mourners, celebrants, or even revered dead. We are reminded that Norse civilization was more than just conquest and warfare by their tombs, which are full with prestige and symbolism. For both men and women, it was about passage, prestige, and power. Viking funerals, both literally and figuratively, were ablaze for generations. However, the flames started to fade by the late 10th and early 11th centuries. It was not because the Norse lost interest in death rites, but rather because Christianity, a new force, was changing the concept of the afterlife itself. The advent of Christianity in Scandinavia resulted in a drastically altered understanding of death. Heaven and hell, sin and salvation, had replaced Valhalla, Helheim, and Folkvanga. Fire was now a punishment rather than a revered thing. Once thought to release the soul, cremation was now viewed as heretical. According to Christian faith, the intact body should be buried facing east in anticipation of resurrection. The change was hastened by the conversion of Viking monarchs, such as Olaf Tryggvason of Norway and Harald Bluetooth of Denmark. Spirituality was not the only thing that these monarchs cared about. Christianity provided monks literacy, political advantages, relationships with strong European countries, and a convenient justification for banning traditional tribal practices and consolidating authority. Cremation was thus forbidden in Viking funeral customs. Animal and human sacrifices were disapproved of. Vulvas were either repressed or assimilated into legends about Christian sainthood. Churches were erected on, abandoned, or robbed pagan burial mounds. To be safe, Norse people frequently started combining the two religions, burying loved ones with both pagan grave items and Christian crosses. It's interesting that this transitional phase wasn't quick or consistent. In isolated places like Iceland, the traditional methods of living tenaciously persist. Even until the 12th century, some people carried on with ship burials or mound construction in secret, occasionally evading church authorities. Others made adjustments, reinterpreting ancient symbols like Thor's hammer as innocuous folk charms or transforming funeral feasts into Christian remembrances. However, the ancient rituals had mostly vanished by the end of the Viking Age. No more sacrificial smoke ascending to Odin, no more burning ships. Rather, the last rest of Norse men and women were defined by the peaceful ground, stone churches, and wooden crosses. Echoes of the past still exist, though. Ancient mounds continue to grow from the terrain in contemporary Scandinavia. Odin and Valhalla are still popular names. Additionally, each time a longship burns across a movie screen, we are reminded of a people who met death with steel, fire, and wind-borne melodies rather than dread. Venetian masks have its roots in power, seclusion, and the desire to be someone else rather than in theatre or pomp. The Republic of Venice had developed into a major hub for trade, culture, and prosperity by the 13th century. Venetians started yearning for something uncommon, the opportunity to escape themselves, as wealth began to pour in from the east, and their society was based on hierarchy and surveillance. The mask entered the picture. Legislators attempted to outlaw masked gaming in 1268, which is the oldest known legal mention of mask wearing in Venice. Yes, there were still temptations to remain anonymous. However, it was during Carnival, a wild season of celebrations preceding Lent, that the masks truly gained popularity. Venice was completely upended during the weeks leading up to the 40 days of piety and self-control. Sins were momentarily pardoned, social classes were hazy, and everyone, nobility to the poor, took to the streets disguised. Masks were weapons, not merely clothing. They made it possible for the inflexible, law-abiding people of Venice to temporarily abandon the expectations of family name, status, and gender. A noblewoman could enter a gambling den covertly, a priest could enter a brothel without anybody seeing, and a servant could mock his master. The mask became destabilized and equalized. The borta, a white mask without a mouth opening that was worn with a black cloak and tricorn hat, was the most popular mask in these early days. It was completely blank, impersonal, and purposefully spooky. The borta was made with purpose in mind rather than style, in contrast to the elaborate designs of succeeding eras. The wearer was able to move, talk, and eat without being noticed. In order to maintain anonymity during voting, it was really required to wear a borta during some political gatherings. Venice was passionate about privacy. The mask was a mirror at the same time. The inconsistencies of Venetian society were mirrored in it: rich but reticent, religious but hedonistic, authoritative but fixated with appearances. The Council of Ten, a mysterious government agency notorious for its secret trials and spy networks, had long dominated the city. In such a setting, concealing one's face became a game as well as a form of defense. Masks were not only accepted but also necessary by the late medieval era. The freedom to play, flirt, resist, and confess was granted to Venetians. And what greater sign than a visage that wasn't truly yours in a city founded on deception and artifice? It was the whole city giving in to fantasy that made Venice's streets appear enchanted during Carnival, not just the masks. Every resident of Venice was a performer for weeks leading up to Lent. Under a flood of song, laughing, and meticulously planned pandemonium, the strict hierarchy, the tight-laced etiquette, the church's watchful eye, and the rules of daily life all fell apart. When the Venetian Senate proclaimed the Carnival of Venice, or Carnevale di Venezia, a public holiday, in 1296 it was first formally recorded. However, its origins were probably earlier and more pagan, maybe connected to the Roman Saturnalia festivities, when roles were inverted and order was merrily disregarded. It was the most well-known celebration in Europe by the Renaissance, attracting travelers, opportunists, and aristocrats from all over the continent. Luxurious palazzi, streets teeming with fire-breathers, jugglers, and spontaneous theatricals were the venues for masked balls. Gondolas brimmed with lanterns and musicians along the Grand Canal. Perfume, suspense, and roasted nuts filled the air. However, beneath all the glitz and glamour, Carnival served as a vent for emotions. Carnival gave Venetians the opportunity to enjoy something they would not have otherwise been able to in a city so preoccupied with decorum and monitoring. Under the cover of anonymity, affairs blossomed, satire flourished, and complaints were expressed through songs, gestures, or practical jokes. Even the clergy, who frequently denounced the excesses, were known to take part, albeit in somewhat less obvious clothing. There was a reason why the ruling class put up with this charade. Carnival was a well-managed delusion of freedom rather than a revolt. People will be submissive later if you let them vent now. It was seduction used for social control. Its crown jewel was the mask. It's interesting to note that laws tried to control the mayhem. Mask wearing was strictly restricted, typically occurring between December 26th and Shrove Tuesday. Masks were prohibited in churches, convents, and gaming establishments throughout the day, even during Carnival. However, these regulations were frequently disregarded or applied only in certain cases. After all, Venice flourished on deftly breaking the law. Being someone else was not the goal of Carnival for Venetians. It was about coming out as themselves without fear of repercussions. And anything seemed feasible when you had a mask on and music playing. The borta is one of Venice's many masks that stands out from the others in both mystery and power. It was unnervingly neutral in its blank look, pointed jawline, and stark white surface. However, this was more than just a costume decision. The borta served as a political manipulation weapon as well as a symbol of freedom. The borta, in contrast to other Venetian masks, was made with functionality in mind. Its distinctive shape protruded from the mouth, enabling the wearer to eat, drink, and converse without taking it off. It was worn with a three-cornered hat, tabaro, and a black silk cloak, giving the ensemble a uniform, almost military look. It was especially intriguing, though, because it wasn't limited to carnival wear. It was frequently mandated by legislation. The border was employed to maintain anonymity in public voting and political assemblies, particularly those involving the Council of Ten or state issues. All the men wore the same disguise, no matter their rank. At least on the surface, it was democracy disguised. Eliminating prejudice, fear, or favor was the goal. The integrity of Venetian administration was preserved as no one could tell who was speaking or casting a ballot. Of course, anonymity might also be used as a weapon in real life. Nobility may travel covertly about the city behind the border, breaking transactions, luring lovers, and whispering secrets. The wearer of the mask had plausible deniability. It made it difficult to distinguish between responsibility and decadence. The border was harmful because of its dualism. It might enable a citizen to voice their opinions or a conspirator to make plans. Additionally, it was unnerving for the general public to see a figure in border. Was a nobleman involved, a spy, a robber, a betrayed romantic partner? Until it was too late, you would never know. The border lacked any expression such as a smile, frown, or flourishes, in contrast to more theatrical masks. It was the anti-mask, formless and faceless but incredibly meaningful. Ironically, this made it the most potent mask of all. The border eventually came to symbolize Venice as a whole, elegant, enigmatic, and subtly threatening. As a reminder of a time when identity could be wiped and reimagined with just a blank white face and a tricorn hat tilt, it continues to be the most recognizable of the Venetian masks to this day. The Moretta was the covert, feminine, and silent mask of control, if the border was the mask of power. The Moretta was an oval-shaped black velvet mask that was worn almost exclusively by ladies. It covered the entire face, highlighting the eyes and hair and making the skin appear paler. But there was a catch. It was strapless. Rather, a little button positioned between the teeth held it in place. Between the teeth, indeed. A woman wearing a Moretta would become entirely silent if she opened her mouth because the mask would fall off. The Moretta's peculiar power entered the picture at that point. This mask transformed the user into a mysterious and intriguing character in a culture that both fetishized and feared female speech. An object of pure fascination was a mute woman in black velvet who could neither speak nor respond or explain herself. It made it possible for women, particularly those from higher social classes, to travel through public areas in a manner akin to a social force field while remaining untouchable, exquisite, and hidden. However, this quiet wasn't merely alluring, it was calculated. The Moretta was used by women to conceal their identities when they were at covert assignations, attending mass, or visiting convents. It allowed courtesans to remain anonymous when interacting with influential customers. The Moretta provided shelter or, in certain situations, plausible deniability in a time when a single scandal might destroy a woman's life. The conflict between female autonomy and social control was also represented by the mask. On the one hand, it gave women the freedom to roam around areas that were dominated by men. Conversely, it really made them silent. It strengthened their objectification while also granting them a certain amount of autonomy. Notably, before going out of style, the Moretta was particularly popular in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Moretta was one of many odd, lovely, and subtly unsettling traditions that disappeared with the fall of the Republic by the time Venice started to deteriorate and the carnival dwindled under Austrian and French control. Nowadays, modern carnival festivities hardly ever feature the Moretta. It is no longer popular to remain silent. However, at the moment, the mask said everything by saying nothing at all. Some Venetian masks originated in the vibrant realm of theatre, while others were instruments of political ritual or incognito. In particular, Commedia dell'arte's raucous, spontaneous performances. Each role had its own unique mask, and these itinerant troupes of actors brought stock characters to life with wit, sarcasm, and physical comedy. These theatrical masks eventually left the stage. They permeated both the carnival itself and the streets of Venice. From the 16th century onward, Commedia dell'arte was extremely popular. The characters in it were immediately recognizable. Arlecchino, Harlequin, the agile servant with a cunning smile and a patchwork clothing, Pantalone, the avaricious elderly businessman with a wrinkled forehead and hooked nose, the arrogant and rambling physician, Il Dottore, never did any real healing, and Colombina, the ingenious maid who didn't require a mask. Her weapon was her expressive face. Everyone in Venetian society could identify with or mock these characters' kinds and roles. Real human characteristics were exaggerated: lust, greed, ignorance, clever. Additionally, because Commedia was based on improvisation, the players adapted their storylines and humor to the current scandals, politics, and local gossip. It combined slapstick humor, satire, and social criticism. These identities poured into the public realm from the stage during Carnival. In addition to playing a role, people dress up as Harlequin or Pantalone to make fun of, flirt with, or express their annoyance with actual powerful people. A Venetian could play the role of the fool everyone secretly pity, mock a haughty official, or mimic an unfaithful lover by donning a Commedia mask. Additionally, these personalities were disarming because they were ubiquitous. They provide a safe space for people to laugh at themselves. Even the authorities let the masks speak for themselves, even though they might disapprove of overt resistance. Who could, after all, take Harlequin into custody? The distinction between performance and participation became hazy as a result of this blending of theatre and reality. Every disguised face became a character, and the entire city turned into a stage. Yes, it was art, but it was also fantasy, emancipation, and resistance. Venetians were able to convey realities that were too risky to speak out loud by donning these theatrical masks. And isn't that the true purpose of Carnival, wearing a falsehood that revealed the reality? Venice, a culture fixated on appearances, walked a tightrope between piety and pleasure, and nowhere was that tension more apparent than in the intricate interaction between the church and masks. On the one hand, the Carnival was a period of extravagant excess, during which Venetians may drink, gamble, flirt, and break social norms while wearing masks. In contrast, Venice was a fervently Catholic republic that was proudly associated with the Pope and was replete with monasteries, churches, and religious celebrations. What was the Church's response to a city full of disguised sinners? Extremely cautious and often contradictory. Carnival was first accepted as a helpful diversion and even encouraged. It made sense to let the folks gorge before Lent while wearing their masks. Soon enough, everyone would be confessing, repenting, and fasting before 40 days of fish stew and shame. It's better to let off steam. But worries were mounting during the 16th and 17th centuries. The mask's obscurity permitted vice to run amok. It wasn't merely harmless celebration. Affair, bribery, robbery, and blasphemy were hidden behind their expressionless faces. Stories of masked revelry poured out of the confessional booths, and there was terror among the clerics. In response, the church issued edicts, lectures, and sometimes even outright bans. In places of worship, some kinds of masks were prohibited. It became illegal to wear a mask inside a church or a monastery. Clowning around in this life could result in divine retribution in the next. Priests cautioned their people. However, enforcement was, at best, patchy. Masked balls were even hosted by bishops. When it suited them, high-ranking authorities chose to ignore the problem. When it came to politics and gold, Venetian society had always been adept at ignoring the situation. Periods of crackdown occurred. For example, during plagues, masks were strictly prohibited by the government because they were thought to spread disease or promote dangerous gatherings. However, these prohibitions, like the carnival itself, were short-lived. Every time the mask came back, the Church's power began to decline in the 18th century as Enlightenment concepts began to gain traction and the Republic began to falter. Venetian carnival became less remorseful, more hedonistic, and more secular, even though it was still based on sacred rhythms. Ultimately, the Church could preach, condemn, and impose restrictions, but it would never be able to reveal Venice completely. It appeared that the soul of the city was always half grace and half gloom. Masks as emblems of freedom, revolt, and sensuality had dominated Venice's streets for centuries. However, all empires eventually fall, and the Republic of Venice was in danger of collapsing by the end of the 18th century. Napoleon Bonaparte, their most formidable foe to yet, confronted the masks that had enchanted Europe. After more than 1,000 years of independence, Venice was overrun by Napoleon's army in 1797. The French occupation signaled a cultural as well as political breakdown. The most tranquil republic, the Serenissima, was disbanded. With military accuracy, its secrets, rituals, and symbols were destroyed, and the carnival was among the first to fall victim. Carnival was viewed as a threat by Napoleon and his successors. They saw masks as instruments of vice, chaos, and rebellion, dangerous in a city already notorious for political intrigue. The occupiers viewed what the Venetians considered play as danger. Carnival was thus completely outlawed. Once worn by people of all classes and creeds, masks were abruptly prohibited outside of theatre and formal gatherings. Surveillance and quiet replaced the colourful riot of Venetian identity overnight. The sounds of boots and bureaucracy replaced the music, laughter, and veiled figures that previously filled the streets. Once one of Venice's most illustrious guilds, the mask makers known as masquereri were forced into obscurity. Some started making theatrical props, others just disappeared. It was more than just a restriction on costumes. A way of life came to an end. Venetians had been using masks for generations to criticize their leaders, transcend social boundaries, and revel in a second, hidden personality. Venice felt vulnerable and confined without them, its dramatic essence uncovered. More constraints and foreign rulers, first Austrians and then Italians, arrived in the 19th century. Carnival vanished, either being retained just on stage or being silently celebrated in back rooms. Once frequented by composers and kings, the big masked balls vanished. The streets that had been the scene of processions and parades became quiet. The Masks of Venice slept for almost 2 centuries, but not forever. In a wave of tourist and cultural renaissance in the late 20th century, Venice's carnival was revived, paying homage to the past while updating it for the contemporary era. Even after being banned, the masks never really vanished, so they came back as art, elegant, theatrical, and slightly nostalgic, rather than as weapons of resistance. It only waited behind the curtain, silently. The stillness that had hung over Venice for almost 2 centuries started to break during the late 20th century, but not with resistance, but with rebirth. The mask made a triumphant comeback when the city formally restored the Carnival of Venice in 1979. This time, however, it had nothing to do with concealed sin or social unrest. It had to do with heritage, art, and yes, travel. The carnival that was reinvented was amazing. Venice became a living theatre once more with the support of international sponsors and regional cultural organizations. Costumed people in ornate 18th century attire filled the streets, moving through the mists like Republic ghosts. Fireworks shimmered atop gondolas, classical music, acrobats and masked balls that now appealed more to the camera than to political anonymity filled Piazza San Marco. What about the masks? They turned into works of art. Maschereri's old guild was revived. Artists started creating one-of-a-kind, vibrant and significant masks by hand, using papier-mâché, porcelain, leather, and even glass. Previously silent souvenir shops now proudly hung masks in their windows like jewelry. Once useful, the designs were now extravagant. Swirling filigree, jeweled brows, glittering feathers, and gold leaf painting. The dramatic volto, a full-faced mask evoking the bauta but frequently more elaborate, is a modern favorite. Women wear the ever-popular colombina, a half-mask that is frequently gilded or feathered, and works of fantasy that draw inspiration from myth, animals, or surrealism. Characters from Commedia dell'arte also made a comeback. Il Dottore, Pantalone, and Harlequin now paraded for pictures rather than mockery. Something was unusual, of course. The perilous and capricious carnival of the previous republic was not the carnival of the 1980s and later. The new carnival was well-planned, profitable, and safe. Instead of being a ritual, it was a reenactment, a festival of memories. Venetians were greatly outnumbered by foreign tourists. Events were ticketed, costumes were hired, and the once secret masks were now proudly shown on Instagram. But the magic continued. Venice remembered how to be someone else for a few weeks every year, how to observe without being seen, how to move silently under a mask. That ancient Venetian charm, mystery encased in elegance, persisted even in the era of cell phones and street sellers. Like Venice itself, the carnival changed, persevered, and glistened again, but it didn't return exactly the same. What made the inhabitants of Venice decide to wear masks for centuries? What caused a society that was so focused on appearances to become so enamored with anonymity? The urge to escape one's assigned identity lies at the heart of the Venetian mask, which is about something incredibly human. The mask was liberation in a world where birth, class, gender, and obligation ruled. Behind it, a man could transform into a woman into a myth. A nun could flirt, a nobleman could admit vulnerability, and a merchant could turn into a rogue. Your face was replaced with the mask, not erased. In this way, masks weren't just fabric and plaster. They were psychological tools that allowed people to question repressive conventions, express prohibited desires, and discover hidden identities. They made it difficult to distinguish between performance and personhood, as well as between actor and audience. And that kind of change made perfect sense in Venice, a city founded on illusion, water, and shifting reflections. The enchantment of the mask endures to this day. The act of masking the face still has force, whether it is at a masquerade ball, Halloween, or a carnival. We adopt new personas, we speak in ways we wouldn't normally, and we feel more brazen, fearless, and liberated. The kind of honesty that reveals the truth by hiding rather than by showing is a peculiar kind of honesty. Another representation of paradox is the Venetian mask. It stands for both tradition and rebellion, anonymity and attention, democracy and hierarchy. It is eerie as well as appealing. It can be exploited to deceive, but it also liberates. In Venice, it let the strong to commit misdeeds without repercussions and the downtrodden to make fun of the powerful. It was both shield and sword. The mask serves as a reminder of what we're losing as the modern world is increasingly monitored, recorded, and exposed. The freedom to remake ourselves without justification, the right to privacy, and the right to mystery. In Venice, people used masks to explore their potential selves rather than to conceal who they were. So next time you see a Venetian mask gleaming with gold, feathers flowing in the breeze, remember it's not simply a souvenir. It is a key to a celebration of freedom, a city of shadows, and the dynamic nature of human yearning. The Kyoto of the early 1860s was no longer a city of tranquil temples and poetic serenity. It had turned into a covert battlefield. Political violence simmered beneath the surface of its holy shrines and wooden eaves. Bodies appeared in rivers, assassins roamed free, and rumors of revolution reverberated in every corner. The pandemonium had a straightforward cause. Japan was dividing itself. After more than 2 centuries of peace under the Tokugawa shogunate, foreign powers, mainly America, Britain, and France, had forced open Japan's frontiers. The sense of seclusion had been shattered by gunboats. As a result, nationalist movements started to unite behind a single concept. Sono Joy, which translates to respect the emperor, drive out the barbarians. However, these were battle cries rather than merely phrases. Perceiving Kyoto as the symbolic center of Japan, pro-imperial samurai from areas such as Choshu and Satsuma started to infiltrate the city. Their objective? Restore imperial authority and weaken the hold of the shogunate. Every battle and every murder was a minor symbolic attack on the established order. The shogunate, situated in Edo, modern-day Tokyo, watched helplessly as its influence unraveled in Kyoto. Although they still had legal authority, the capital was making fun of them. In response, the Roshigumi, a transient militia of ronin, or masterless samurai, were dispatched by the shogunate to serve as a bodyguard for the shogun when he visited Kyoto in 1863. However, an unforeseen event occurred. A renegade gang of 13 ronin refused to depart when the mission was over. They regarded Kyoto not only as a duty, but as a calling. These men would form the nucleus of the Shinsengumi. These warriors, who were supported by the shogunate's strong ally, the Aizu domain, were sent to monitor Kyoto and hunt down anti-shogunate agitators. Unlike typical samurai, they weren't nobility or hereditary warriors. Many had modest or even disgraceful origins. However, they shared a passion for blood if necessary and unwavering devotion to the shogunate. Once the peaceful capital of emperors, Kyoto was suddenly under attack from within. A new force, clad in blue jackets, brandishing swords, and imposing order with icy determination, sprang from the smoke and paranoia. It was the Shinsengumi. At first, the Shinsengumi was just a motley crew of ronin on a mission, but within a few short years they transformed into one of the most dreaded forces in Kyoto, a sword-wielding police corps clothed in blue haori and saturated in the blood of rebels. 3 important leaders, Serizawa Kamo, Kondo Isami, and Hijikata Toshizo, were at the center of this change. They were all driven, well-behaved, and not samurai, which was considered offensive in ancient feudal Japan. However, they made up for their lack of ancestry with passion and intensity. Serizawa, one of the initial co-founders, was belligerent, unpredictable, and ultimately self-destructive. His careless actions, inebriated altercations, extortion, and even assaults on defenseless bystanders jeopardized the legitimacy of the nascent organization. Hijikata, his cold, fervently devoted lieutenant, and Kondo, a former instructor at the Tenin Rishin Ryu school, saw the threat. Thus they organized a purge in 1863. Serizawa and his adherents were killed in a night raid by their own comrades. The Shinsengumi were merciless, effective, and set the example for their future loyalty to the shogun, to one another, and to internal dissension. The Shinsengumi established a rigorous code of conduct under Kondo's leadership and Hijikata's severe discipline. Members were prohibited from participating in private dueling, deserting, or defying commands. The fine? Ritual suicide is called seppuku. You sacrificed everything for the Shinsengumi, including your name, sword, and life. They were easily recognizable thanks to their unusual attire, a light blue haori jacket frequently striped with white. It served as a psychological weapon as much as a badge of honor. People in Kyoto knew conflict was imminent when they saw the coats in the fog. But this wasn't simply about brute strength. The Shinsengumi considered themselves to be the last samurai idealists of a dying tradition. They clung to Bushido, which stands for loyalty, discipline, and martial excellence, during a period when many warriors were giving up the sword for politics or guns. They didn't want to modernize, they wanted to purify. As a result, Kyoto's streets shook. Conspirators were either questioned or put to death, and assassins were pursued. One sword stroke at a time, the Shinsengumi were altering order rather than merely upholding it. If there was one event that transformed the Shinsengumi from unrecognized neighborhood guards to renowned shogunate defenders, it was the Ikedaya incident of 1864. With swords drawn and reputations etched in blood, the Shinsengumi altered the course of Japan's twilight era on a muggy July night in the middle of Kyoto, surrounded by paper lanterns and wooden hallways. There had been rumors that the anti-shogunate samurai, including the pro-imperial Choshu clan, were planning a major fire attack to destroy Kyoto and kill or kidnap high-ranking officials. The objective? Destabilize the shogunate, sow discord, and mobilize the populace to support the emperor. Working as both spies and swordsmen, the Shinsengumi learned of the scheme and tracked it down to the Ikedaya Inn, a covert lodging establishment close to Sanjo Street. Kondo Isami headed a tiny team of only 10 guys after receiving a tip. Soon after, Hijikata Toshizo arrived with troops. They entered a room crowded with armed revolutionaries, many more than the Shinsengumi. What came next was more of a massacre than a battle. The Shinsengumi launched a fierce surprise attack in a small area that was only dimly lighted by oil lamps and the odd flash of steel. Screams rang out through the night. Tatami mats became scarlet, walls broke, and the inn exploded into chaos. 2 hours later, the plan to destroy Kyoto was completely thwarted. At least 7 rebels were killed, and numerous others were injured or taken prisoner. The price? A few Shinsengumi members were hurt, and one was killed. However, the benefit? National renown. The Shinsengumi were commended by the Tokugawa shogunate for rescuing Kyoto. People started to view them as essential protectors. One thing was acknowledged by even their most critical detractors: the wolves in blue were incredibly successful. However, the Ikedaya episode also exposed a deeper truth. The Shinsengumi were assassins with legal protection. In addition to being law-abiding protectors, they became more powerful, more fearsome, and had more adversaries. The Shinsengumi were no longer seen as mere barriers by the pro-imperial samurai. They were barbarians who were used by an outmoded government to massacre their own citizens on behalf of a collapsing shogunate. But that night was evidence of intent for Kondo and Hijikata. In order to maintain order, they had drawn their swords, and they would not put them down until the shogunate either remained strong or they themselves fell. It was more than simply physical power that propelled the Shinsengumi to prominence following the Ikedaya incident. It came about as a result of a disciplined society, precise martial skills, and brutal psychological warfare. There were many of armed men in Kyoto, but the Shinsengumi stood out in a terrible way. They had a famous training schedule. Every day, recruits practiced at Commander Kondo Isami's sword school, Tenin Rishin Ryu. This method was designed for deadly battle in confined spaces, not for graceful dueling. Temples packed with people, alleys and inn-rooms. The type of swordplay that was effective on actual streets in Kyoto, rather than on gleaming dojo floors. They also used more than simply steel in their battles. Intelligence and surveillance were key to their plan. Many of the informants in the Shinsengumi's close-knit network were posing as commoners, monks, or traders. They eavesdropped on the whispers of rebels, intercepted messages, and followed suspected around. They already knew everything when they hit: allies, hiding places, and names. But their true weapon was dread. The midnight knock was dreaded by the people of Kyoto. As men were taken away, frequently never to be seen again, there was a sudden raid, a flutter of sandals on wood, and the distinctive flash of light blue hari. Zero tolerance was a reputation of the Shinsengumi. a single disobedient mutter might result in immediate interrogation, physical assault, or execution. They even considered non-compliance to be seppuku. With icy determination, Hijikata Toshizo, also known as the Demon Vice Commander, upheld this culture. He established a core that required more than just obedience. He was cold, cunning, and intensely committed to the Tokugawa cause. Identity was required. Individuals were no longer members. They prioritized Shinsengumi over men. Their numbers increased. At its height, the core had grown from its original 13 members to around 200. However, there was a cost to this expansion. Not every recruit was as fervent as the first members. A few were spies, others broke under the strain. Internal purges grew widespread. Brothers became adversaries. Nevertheless, the Shinsengumi maintained a single, unwavering belief, despite everything, that it was worthwhile to protect Japan's feudal system. They were not squabbling over pay. The samurai world, where devotion triumphed over politics and the sword defined truth, was the ideal they were fighting for. However, no matter how keen, aspirations can shatter. And more quickly than any katana could strike, the world around them was starting to alter. The ground beneath the Shinsengumi started to change as the 1860s progressed. They had promised their life to defend the Tokugawa shogunate, which was losing power in Japan. Its underpinnings had been broken by economic unrest, internal dissension, and external pressure. What had started out as a loyalty issue quickly turned into a survival issue. Outside of Kyoto, the emperor was gaining support from strongholds such as Satsuma and Choshu. These clans, who had previously been adversaries, now had a common opponent in the Tokugawa government. Additionally, these domains were modernizing their armies, buying firearms, training with Western officers, and getting ready for war, while the Shinsengumi were preoccupied chasing down rebels in alleyways. The age of the bullet was surpassing the age of the sword. Public sentiment was also changing within the city. The heroic reputation of the Shinsengumi had started to deteriorate. Once considered vital, their rigid techniques were now considered cruel. Their patrols were not respected, but feared, and it no longer felt like justice after they killed. It had a desperate feel about it. The final blow came in 1867. The final shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, resigned and returned control to the emperor. This shift appeared to be calm at first. However, it was a calculated action meant to maintain Tokugawa power under a new imperial guise. It was quickly exposed by the forces that supported imperialism. The emperor now owned Kyoto. The capital had switched sides. Still, the Shinsengumi would not budge. Yoshinobu's resignation was a betrayal, but it wasn't the end for them. They moved to the village of Fushimi, which is south of Kyoto, and started getting ready for combat. The Shinsengumi, who were still primarily armed with swords, were in danger of falling behind the pro-imperial force, which was moving quickly with its new weapons. A civil battle between the new imperial forces and the old Tokugawa regime, they dubbed it the Boshin Battle. One of the last actual samurai battalions to serve in it would be the Shinsengumi. They refused to modernize, they refused to give up their code, and they most definitely refused to take off their blue coats even while the world around them was changing at gunpoint. Rather, they honed their weapons and advanced on the last battleground in history. The Battle of Toba Fushimi, which would spark the Boshin War and signal the beginning of the end for the samurai order, was the Shinsengumi's most difficult task in January 1868 as snow drifted over the outskirts of Kyoto. Still devoted to the Tokugawa ruler, the Shinsengumi joined a small group of Tokugawa soldiers in taking up guns. Their adversary, a confederation of soldiers from the Satsuma, Choshu, and Tosa domains, was equipped with modern rifles, artillery, and Western training, in addition to swords. Wearing their distinctive blue haori and brandishing antiquated weapons and katanas, The Shinsengumi appeared to be romantic, arrogant, and sadly outclassed relics from a bygone era. Kondo Isami was in charge of the Shinsengumi, but he was no longer the nimble swordsman of Ikadai renown. He had slowed due to age, injury, and duty. Even Hijikata Toshizo, his trusty subordinate, was unable to overlook the disparity in weaponry, despite his unwavering fierceness. With the use of cannon blasts and bursts of gunfire, the battle started, making swordplay all but worthless. The Shinsengumi nevertheless charged with the valor of a traditional samurai. In close quarters, they killed enemy riflemen. Despite their disciplined and defiant defense of their lines, it was insufficient. Many Tokugawa soldiers, disheartened and perplexed, declined to fire on the imperial forces' golden banner, which stood in for the emperor. A few gave up, others ran away. Neither was done by the Shinsengumi. After fighting until their lines were breached, they withdrew in a smoke and blood haze. The number of casualties was high. People's spirits were broken. Kyoto's days of narrow street attacks were over. The Shinsengumi were already relics, and this was a contemporary conflict of a new scale. There was more to the Toba Fushimi defeat than just a military one. It was the old Japan's symbolic demise. The Tokugawa were formally proclaimed enemies of the throne by the imperial court. All at once, Kyoto's samurai guardians had turned into criminals. The Shinsengumi, however, refused to disband even as their world fell apart. They took one last vow, gathered, and went south. They would keep battling for honor, not for victory. They would at least die as fighters if they were unable to win the war. The shogunate's remaining wolves weren't prepared to disappear. Not quite yet. Following the humiliating loss at Toba Fushimi, the Shinsengumi were no longer considered Kyoto's protectors. They were on the run. The emperor now owned their beloved city, which they had previously patrolled, with swords in hand and law on their lips. They were now marked for death by the blue jackets that formerly inspired fear. However, retreating did not equate to giving up. The remaining Shinsengumi reorganized and joined the Tokugawa remnants escaping north, under the leadership of the uncompromising Hijikata Toshizo. Despite his wounds and demoralization, Kondo Isami continued to hold on to his position of leadership, despite the weariness of war. In an effort to restore peace to the east, they banded together and formed under the Koyo Chinbutai. In actuality, however, they were pursuing a vanished phantom of power. Haunted by the thought that their world was coming to an end, they moved from province to province while being pursued by imperial armies. The Shinsengumi became more resolute as more Tokugawa supporters defected or surrendered. They refused to exchange pardons for their swords. They refused to bow down. Kondo was taken prisoner by imperial soldiers in April 1868 as he tried to join comrades in Edo. His identity was discovered even though he was using a false identity. The punishment was swift. Beheading was the method of execution. His head was put on public display in Kyoto as a sobering reminder to those who continued to adhere to traditional practices. His passing was a terrible blow. Kondo had served as the father figure and symbol of loyalty for the Shinsengumi. Hijikata, however, did not cry. Sharpening his blade, he continued northward. Hijikata and his waning band joined the Republic of Ezo, a brief breakaway republic set up on Hokkaido by loyalist remnants, which was the last Tokugawa resistance as the imperial army advanced. The Shinsengumi wanted to make a last stand there. As long as there was breath left, they would defend Japan, even though it was a desolate, windswept spot at the edge of the earth. Despite their tiny numbers and limited resources, Hijikata had an unwavering will. He thought their sacrifice, even in loss, would be recalled as loyalty to a fading code rather than as rebellion. They had ceased to be Kyoto's guardians and police force. They had already started to lose their honor with the cherry blossoms, and now they were ghosts, searching north through snow and grief. The Shinsengumi had pursued the fading Tokugawa dream as far north as could by 1869, when Hokkaido was still known as Izo. The few remaining supporters of the shogunate sought sanctuary on this icy, undeveloped, and untamed frontier. There, under the leadership of former Navy officer Enomoto Takeaki, a last-ditch effort was made to maintain their vision of Japan through the Republic of Ezo, the country's first and only republic. The Defense Forces Vice Commander was Hijikata Toshizo, who is currently the Shinsengumi's de facto head. The enigmatic guardian of Kyoto's alleys was no more. As a commander, he planned defense lines, organized troops, and got ready for what he undoubtedly knew would be a futile last struggle. Less than 100 men, worn out and scarred, the Shinsengumi were by now just a sliver of their former selves. Yet they survived because of Hijikata. Leading from the front, he rode in uniform with a sword by his side. He was no longer looking for triumph. The death was one to remember. The well-equipped and sophisticated Imperial Army attacked Hokkaido in full force. They took control of stronghold after stronghold, driving the remaining samurai warriors in the direction of the last bastion, Hakodate. Hijikata stood there in the midst of the frigid northern sea and artillery fire. Hijikata was shot in the lower back by enemy fire on June 20, 1869, during a combat close to the fort of Ippongi. His age was 34, a fitting finish for a man out of time, the demon vice commander who had survived purges, civil war, and revolution, was put to death rather than dying in a blaze of sword-to-sword glory. His remains were never found. Some claim that devoted allies buried it in secret. Others think that in order to prevent defilement, he was cremated. But in his last letter, which he sent just before the war, he expressed pride and asked that his legacy be remembered without any resentment. The Shinsengumi essentially vanished with Hijikata's passing. The Tokugawa loyalist struggle came to an end when the Republic of Ezo submitted a few days later. The regime of Meiji had prevailed. The age of the samurai was over. However, the ghost of Hijikata persisted in Hakodate's snow and quiet. Despite losing the war, he retained his code, and he became immortal as a result. Despite their eventual loss and dissolution, the Shinsengumi's influence endured much beyond the battlefield. The world they had battled to protect was disappearing in Meiji-era Japan, which was modernizing quickly, but the Shinsengumi's tale became a potent representation of sacrifice, loyalty, and the samurai spirit. Japan gave up feudalism, adopted Western technology, and restructured its social structure during the Meiji Restoration. Swords were outlawed, a new national army was established, and the samurai class was disbanded. For many, the Shinsengumi were a thing of the past, ferocious, unyielding, and sadly outclassed by modernity. However, their story struck a profound chord, particularly in theatre, literature, and later movies. They were depicted by writers as tragic heroes, men who fought for a vanishing ideal despite knowing that the world was changing. They captivated imaginations with their rigorous code of conduct, unwavering brotherhood, and willingness to sacrifice anything. Among the most renowned were Okita Soji, the young sword prodigy whose talent became famous despite his illness, Kondo Isami, the noble leader who was executed with dignity, and Hijikata Toshizo, the demon vice commander whose iron will defined the group's identity. The Shinsengumi are now considered a cultural icon both in Japan and beyond. Manga, anime, and film all feature their blue haori, unique swords, and tales of unwavering devotion. In Kyoto and Tokyo, historical reenactments and museums honor their heritage, attracting tourists captivated by their dramatic past. Beyond sentimentality, The legacy of the Shinsengumi serves as a reminder of the conflict between tradition and modernity. They found themselves at the intersection of feudal regulations, contemporary laws, and samurai swords and rifle barrels. Their battle was intensely emotional as well as political, and it reflected the conflict that many societies have when faced with relentless development. The Shinsengumi were more than just samurai police in the end. They were guys who prioritized allegiance over convenience, action over hopelessness, and honor over safety. They came to represent a vanishing past and the enduring human will to hold fast even as everything crumbles in a world speeding toward the future.